I saw the same pattern. Victims being sidelined, offenders not being dealt with properly. I couldn't understand what was going on. I lost my career, I lost my income. I really thought I was losing my mind, but somewhere deep inside me, I couldn't let go of what I saw. The gang networks, the abuse networks are so well developed, so sophisticated. The perpetrators were predominantly Pakistani Muslim men. The victims were almost exclusively very vulnerable and very young white children. Head of serious crime, head of public protection. I went to the chief constable, children's commissioner, home office, and every time a door was slammed in my face, they didn't want to rock the multicultural boat. When Elon Musk tweeted, that blew it up to reach an international audience. When we're talking about going into a new statutory national inquiry, recommendations at the end of such a long inquiry should be obligations, and it shouldn't be left to the men in grey suits in the back office at the Home Office to decide that they know better than the 7,500 victims.
Hello, I'm Georgina Mumford, and I'm delighted to be joined today by former detective constable, best known for her role in exposing the Grooming-gangs cover-up, Maggie Oliver. Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Georgina.
Maggie, for those who aren't familiar with your story, could you take us back to the beginning and maybe talk about if there was a moment when you were a police constable in Greater Manchester or working on Operation Augusta when you first encountered child sexual exploitation and you realised not only that the police had a major issue with this, but also that they were actively failing the victims involved?
I first became aware of what's called the grooming-gang scandal or the rape gang scandal back in 2004 when I was asked to go on a case that became known as Operation Augusta. That was in Manchester, and I saw that. I worked on that job for about a year and a half, and at the end of that time, my husband was terminally ill, and I went off work in his last couple of months to look after him. And at that point, when I went off work, we'd identified 97 men, predominantly Pakistani Muslim men, who were recruiting and raping a whole series of children who lived in care homes. We'd identified over 36 children. When I came back to work after my husband died, that job, which was called Operation Augusta, had been completely buried. It had been closed down. Not one of those 97 men had been charged or prosecuted or arrested, and it was as though that job had never happened. So that was my first introduction to grooming gangs, and it was the first time in my life, but most definitely in my career, that I had ever seen anything like that happen, and I could not get my head around it.
And when you did decide to speak out and resign from your job, as you did, what were the consequences of that?
I tried to get answers when I went back to work about why Augusta was closed. I couldn't, other than to say that there wasn't sufficient evidence. That was always a lie, because the evidence was there. And in 2020, GMP had to reopen that case. They renamed it, but they reopened it from the same starting point that was the finish point on Augusta. I was then, I guess, headhunted in 2010 to join a case which became the Rochdale case. And I was given cast iron guarantees that there wouldn't be a repeat of what I'd seen on Augusta. But, about 8-9 months later, I saw the same pattern of victims being sidelined, offenders not being dealt with properly, inadequate charges, and even as a tactical option, adding one of the children who was being horrendously raped onto the indictment as one of the gang of abusers. And I couldn't understand what was going on. And initially, Georgina, I thought it was one lazy officer who couldn't be bothered doing their job. But I decided, despite my fear, that I was going to go to the most senior officers in GMP, and make them aware of what I was seeing. So I went through, head of serious crime, head of public protection. I went to the chief constable. I went to the IOPC, children's commissioner, home office. And every time a door was slammed in my face, it kind of made me more and more angry. But it also really frightened me, because I realized then that I was, that this was not that they didn't know what was going on. It was that they knew and they wanted to do nothing about it. And in all honesty, I was the problem. And so I was threatened by a very senior officer, verbally and in writing. The very clear message was that if you don't remain silent, that you can go to prison for this and you will be arrested. So at that point, I was very, very frightened. I really was frightened I would go to prison. I also knew, though, that what I was seeing was wrong. And I ultimately had two choices either, and I was told very clearly, come to work. I was told that senior officers make decisions. As a junior officer, you do as you're told. And if you can't do that, you're in the wrong job. Well, number one, when I joined the police, I swore an oath of attestation in which I promised to uphold the law, to protect the vulnerable, to act with integrity, to uphold fundamental human rights. I never promised to do as I was told. And secondly, I have children of my own, and I knew always that this was wrong. And whether my bosses and, senior politicians were saying, turn away from this, do nothing, I didn't need to be a police officer to know that dozens of men raping dozens, hundreds, thousands of children was wrong. And so ultimately I had to answer to my own conscience, and that led to me, it made me very, very ill though. I was, I spent 15 months as a serving police officer trying to be heard, initially not believing the chief constable knew what was happening or that the home office knew. I now know very, very clearly that they all knew what was happening. I was the problem. They wanted to turn a blind eye to what was going on, and me, rocking the boat. They tried everything in their power to make me remain silent. But, I have perhaps a very overdeveloped sense of what's right and wrong when it comes to child protection. And whichever way I looked, this was so wrong that it led to me resigning. And by doing that, I lost everything, in all honesty, Georgina. I lost my family home because I lost my career, I lost my income. I really thought I was losing my mind. My last day at work, I ended up, I was unconscious. I collapsed and I was unconscious on the floor. It made me very, very ill. But somewhere deep inside me, I couldn't let go of what I saw. And if I didn't speak out, then in my mind, I was as bad as those senior public servants who were knowingly turning away from generations of children who were being raped and abused on an industrial scale, and the authorities were turning away because it was a political hot potato, if you like, because the perpetrators were predominantly Pakistani Muslim men. The victims were almost exclusively very vulnerable and very young white children. On Augusta, all those children were in care and were just abandoned to the wind by the state. And I made a promise to myself that I would do everything I could to raise awareness, to inform the country, to educate the country about what was going on. And that's become my life since 2013. And, I was the program consultant on the drama 3 girls for 4 years. I started my own charity in 2019. And in the past 6 years, 6.5, 7 years, we've now supported almost 5,000 victims and survivors of abuse. And the week before last, we were granted leave in the High Court to take the government to a judicial review for failing to implement the 20 recommendations of ICSA, which was a 7-year, £200 million statutory national inquiry where 7,500 victims and survivors of abuse gave evidence. So it's kind of followed me every step of the way since the day I walked off the job.
And Maggie, I do want to ask you about the fact that a couple of weeks ago you did take the government to court over the failure to implement advice that was given in the inquiry 4 years ago now, I believe. Can you tell us a bit more about your decision to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I gave 16 years of my life to being a police officer, and I have recognized over these years that so much of what I have said and that many people say is actually just noise. You know, it might be true and it's educated the country, but ultimately accountability and justice has to come through legal channels. So ICSA was a statutory national inquiry that took 7 years, and the recommendations that came out of it, in my opinion, don't go far enough. And, you know, ICSA was many different strands. So it looked at abuse in the Catholic Church, abuse in the Church of England. It looked at abuse in Knoll View, Cyril Smith and all his cronies. It looked at Lord Janner. There was lots of different strands. One strand was called organised networks, and that was supposed to look at grooming gangs. I was a core participant in that, and it was a complete and utter whitewash. And I've always said that. It was a cover-up from start to finish when you look at the organised networks strand, at the grooming gang. But all the other strands, or many other strands, were more openly scrutinised, especially those that referred to the past. So, you know, Cyril Smith was dead. Lord Janner was, I don't know if he was actually dead then or he was too old to stand trial. So there was no risk there in exposing those things. So the 20 recommendations that came at the end of that inquiry don't go far enough. But after 7 years and 7,500 victims giving evidence, those recommendations shouldn't just sit on a shelf gathering dust while successive governments decide they're not going to do anything with them. And when we're talking about going into a new statutory national inquiry, we're going to potentially put thousands more victims and survivors through a horrendous process where they re-traumatize themselves to tell their stories in the hope that change will come. Now, that's what happened on ICSA. And yet, all these years later, we are still waiting for those recommendations to be implemented. And it begs the question, if a statutory national inquiry that delivers recommendations after all that work, if those recommendations, any government can just decide they're not going to bring them in, what is the point of a statutory inquiry at all? And I would like the government to bring in those recommendations. I have no power to force them to do that. But what I do want the country to know is that if a judicial review and a court can't force the government to bring them in, the question has to be asked, what point is there to any national inquiry, in all honesty? You know, for me, recommendations at the end of such a long inquiry should be obligations, and it shouldn't be left to the men in grey suits in the back office at the Home Office to decide that they know better than a 7-year inquiry and 7,500 victims. You know, we're being told now that they're going to consult with stakeholders. Well, I'm sorry, you don't need stakeholders. That national inquiry explored and gave evidence on which those recommendations were made. So some faceless person that comes in now and overrides the recommendations of a national inquiry. For me, the country needs to know that that's what's going on, and whether or not we achieve what we set out to do in this judicial review, even if we don't, the whole country will know the state of play. And I'm eternally grateful to the judge who oversaw, who led on that judicial review hearing 2 weeks ago. He had scrutinized everything, and in law, he's quite right. There is no obligation on a government to implement recommendations of any inquiry. It's entirely up to them. What the judge found, though, his judgment said that since in 2000, his judgment was that the country has a legitimate expectation that after such a lot of work and all those years and all those victims being promised change, that the country and victims and survivors have a legitimate expectation that those recommendations will be implemented. So he's given us permission to take the government to a full judicial review in relation to all 20 recommendations. So not just the 3 that we had challenged, all 20 recommendations. And he based that finding, Georgina, on 3 things. The first one, when Theresa May announced the national inquiry back in 2014, she said it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to bring accountability for the failures of the past, to bring change for the future, ensure that children are safeguarded now, and that there will be change in the future. That's not happened. Furthermore, last year, Yvette Cooper said that there would be publication of a timescale before last Easter. That's not happened either. And there's been other public announcements in the House of Commons that would lead the country to believe these recommendations were going to be brought in. That hasn't happened. There's still no timeline. There's no promise that they're going to bring in all these recommendations. So on that basis, we've been given leave to go to a full judicial review. Now, whether we win that or not, we are doing all that is legally available to hold the government to account. The scandal also is really, Georgina, that my small charity has to pay for this action. The government the other week tried to argue that we should not even have a cost capping order, that, they've got all the public purse to throw everything they've got at defending the indefensible. We're a tiny national charity. We had to get donations to fund this action against the government, and we're going to have to fund the next part as well. We're going to have to go out and seek donations from members of the public who believe in what we're doing. And I feel that we are taking this forward for the country. It shouldn't be necessary, but sadly, it's the only way we are going to either get these recommendations brought into law, or we're going to show very clearly that the government have no intention of doing so. So either way, I think it's a win for us. It can no longer be the waters are very muddied, and it's all smoke and mirrors. There's no straight talking. It's all about kind of kidology, really, and lies. And I think this is showing very clearly that is the case.
And Maggie, you've been pushing for justice for these girls for such a long time now, about 14 years of your life, as you said. To take it back a bit, I think from a policing perspective, the average person who's only found out about the grooming gangs since that inquiry a few years ago would really struggle to understand how the police could know about this issue and have not acted on it, or have not taken the necessary steps to stop it. Could you tell us a bit more about what those mechanisms at play, perhaps, or what those institutional failings were that meant that the abuse in places like Rochdale went on for so long?
Yeah, I mean, I've asked myself that question many, many times, because from day one, when I first saw this in 2004, for me, it was just such a huge wrong that it needed to be addressed. And initially, I believed it was being. But in the 20 years since then, I know 150% that there has been a deliberate turning away from this issue. And I've questioned many times why that is. And I still come to the same conclusion. I think that, number one, the ethnicity, the culture of the perpetrators, who are predominantly Pakistani Muslim men, in this kind of child abuse. That's not to say that child abusers don't come from in every shape and form, in the Catholic Church, Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, Jimmy Savile. The BBC covered up all of that. The church covered up. But in these rape gangs, the perpetrators are predominantly Pakistani Muslim men. The victims are almost all very young, very vulnerable, young white children, often, not always, but often and usually from difficult backgrounds, where nobody is fighting for those kids. And what happened in these cases is that those in power, so the police, politicians, council leaders, the CPS, made a judgment that nobody's going to be bothered whether these children are protected or not. Nobody is actually going to fight their corner. We can just abandon them and nobody will care. We will get away with it. And they did that because they didn't want to rock the multicultural boat. There was a fear that there would be race riots in the street. And I know that from my time on Augusta. That job was buried. It closed down with not one of those 97 child rapists prosecuted. Over 36 children that I knew at the time were being abused. We now know it was well over 70. Those children were just abandoned to their fate. They were not protected. That the men were not prosecuted. It was buried under the carpet as though it had never happened. And had I not gone public, nobody even knew that job had existed, because none of the rapes were even crimed. So there was an intention to cover up the abuse because of the uncomfortable truth that they were Pakistani Muslim men. There were some that were from Afghanistan or Iran, but they were still of the same lower class of Muslim men. And many of them were from a particular area in Pakistan as well, I've learned over the years. Nobody was going to cause a stink because of these children. I mean, on Augusta, they all lived in care homes, and the organisations that were covering up were social services, were the council, were the police and the CPS. And the third factor, which I think is a big part of it, is that the authorities were not prepared to put the resources in to the time and the work that would be needed to investigate these cases, because they are very complex, because they've been allowed to develop over decades. The gang networks, the abuse networks are so well developed, so sophisticated. The abusers know full well how to get away with being identified or held to account. And it was easier for the authorities to turn away and pretend that it wasn't happening. Unfortunately, partly down to me, because I've never shut up about it, but also some other notable exceptions. Andrew Norfolk in the Times. We've kept on chipping away, and bit by bit, the truth has been uncovered. I think now, when I first started speaking out, Georgina, I was very much a lone voice. People didn't want to talk about it. The north of England became more aware more quickly than the south. I think last year when Elon Musk tweeted, I think that blew it up to reach an international audience. That's when the national media became more interested, with a few exceptions. I mean, the drama Three Girls, I worked on that for 4 years as the program consultant. That really did educate the country about the grooming gangs. What it didn't do, though, it didn't expose the phase of the police and the social services and the CPS. It kind of sanitized their involvement because the BBC made it, and they were not going to expose the systemic failures within the state, which were not mistakes. They were neglect on a monumental scale. And I would like to see senior police and senior council leaders, social workers or social services bosses charged with misconduct in a public office. I would like to see them in prison, because this is neglect on an industrial scale. And the children who were abused, my charity, the Maggie Oliver Foundation, we are trying to help them pick up the pieces of their broken lives. And it's not the abuse alone that has destroyed their lives. It's by the way they've been treated by the protective agencies, by the statutory organisations whose duty it was to protect them. They have been abandoned. They've been criminalised. They've been blamed. I've seen children made pregnant where a fetus in Rochdale, was seized without consent or knowledge of the 13-year-old little girl, put in a property store where it was locked away for 2 years until it came to light in a property review. That was the reason, one of the main reasons, that the Rochdale case was reopened. Not because they cared about the kids, but because they'd got a physical piece of evidence that had come into the light. I mean, I could go on forever. And if anybody wants to know the full journey to 2019, I wrote a book called Survivors. You can read because it is so complicated, Georgina, and there are so many threads going through it. But ultimately, it was a deliberate neglect. It was misconduct in a public office. It was abandoning vulnerable children on an industrial scale. It was turning a blind eye knowingly to child abuse, rape, torture, trafficking. Lives were destroyed on a scale that I've not seen anywhere else. Not a mistake. Systemic failure, institutional neglect, misconduct in a public office. And I would like to see, senior public servants held accountable for those failures.
Maggie, you mentioned quite a horrifying detail earlier, which is that one of the victims that you dealt with had actually been listed among the abusers rather than as a victim. How common were cases like that, and why did they happen?
Well, in that case, if anybody's watched the drama Three Girls, that the child Amber is that child, and Amber was one of the children that I was asked to gain the trust of in Rochdale. She was identified before I even went near that job as one of our key victims. We knew she'd been abused. We knew she'd been raped on an industrial scale. But she had also been arrested when she was 15 by the police. And so because of that, she was hugely damaged, mistrustful of the police, and didn't want to speak to any police officers. To her everlasting credit, she eventually allowed me into her home, into her life, and she spent 7-8 months pretty much every day going to video interviews. She identified all her abusers. She named dozens of men who had raped her, picked them out in ID parades, and was going to court as one of the main victims in that case. I was told on a Friday afternoon that the bosses, CPS, police, had changed their mind and they were no longer going to use Amber as a victim. At that moment, I walked off that job because I was horrified. This was not. There'd been policies written about her. The most senior lawyer in the CPS at the time had acknowledged her as a victim before we'd ever gone anywhere near her. And suddenly she's not a victim anymore. What ultimately happened though, Georgina, in relation to Amber, about probably a year later, maybe 9 months later, after I'd walked off that job and it was almost about to go to trial, the barrister, having got her head around what had actually happened and seen the evidence that Amber had given to the investigation, realised that they needed Amber's evidence in court in order to run that trial. And anybody who understands the criminal justice system will know that in order to have your account shared in a trial, in a court, before a jury, the only accounts that are admissible are either if you are a victim or a witness, or you are an offender. Well, by this time, it was much too late to bring Amber back into the fold as the victim that she is and always was. So instead, and I'm quoting here, the authorities, the CPS and the police, decided that as a tactical option, and I quote, they were going to add Amber to the indictment as one of the gang of paedophiles. Now, again, anybody who understands the justice system knows that in order to be interviewed or you have to be arrested, cautioned, offered legal advice. Amber was not even made aware of how they were going to portray her in court. She was never told. She was never arrested. She never had legal representation. And the reason was because any lawyer worth their salt would have immediately said, well, a year ago, you had scrutinized everything that happened and identified her as a victim. So they had to avoid that at all costs. So instead, they secretly added her onto the indictment as a paedophile, portraying her as an older madam in the trial. They also then tried to take her children away from her after the trial based on the fact that she was a paedophile. Now, it took me 10 years of fighting, and then 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, the new chief constable of Greater Manchester Police finally acknowledged that this had been borderline incompetent. All Amber's rapes are now recorded. She is formally acknowledged as the victim that she always was. And due to the fact that, I took her to get legal advice and fought alongside her, she never lost her children. But so the police apologized. It can never undo what was done. But interestingly, the CPS, despite the fact we took action against the CPS as well, the CPS have never apologized, and they still won't confirm or say that they will not use that tactic again. So these are the things that are going on behind closed doors, and it's really because of my inside knowledge of having worked on these cases that those facts came to light. So, I don't know what's gone on in many of the other towns and cities where these gangs have operated, but I do know that when you ask for the information, it is very rarely forthcoming. It's hidden, it's buried away. So I think the fact that I worked on them and I knew the truth and I was prepared to fight to expose that meant that it raised awareness, and the country knows now from the inquiries that I've been involved in that I was not making it up. It's formally and publicly acknowledged that those things I've said to you are true.
Maggie, lastly, I wanted to ask you about your charity, the Maggie Oliver Foundation. This was founded to help survivors of abuse, many of whom have been treated awfully, as you've just described. Can you tell us a bit about the work that your charity does?
Yeah, I'm very, very proud of where we are with the Maggie Oliver Foundation. I started because I was actually completely burnt out, but I knew in 2019 from all the work I'd done in the previous 7-8 years that there were so many victims with nowhere to turn that I decided I would try and build an army of people like me to help and support those who were lost and alone, really. I made the commitment right at the start, though, that I would not accept any commissioned money. I didn't want money from the Police and Crime Commissioner, from the government, because I want to be able to tell the truth as victims and survivors tell us, share that truth and fight for the changes we need. But I didn't feel that we could do that without helping the individuals who are lost and alone, in all honesty. So we offer ongoing emotional support to any adult survivor of any kind of sexual abuse, whether it's, male or female, whether they've been raped in the home or a stranger rape, or they're a victim of a grooming gang. We are funded entirely by public donations. We've had a little bit of money from the lottery, Henry Smith Foundation and the Tudor Trust. Other than that, it's private people who believe that what we are doing is important. We're offering an incredibly unique but important service for those who have nowhere to go. Because in all honesty, Georgina, the state is failing on all of these levels. We're trying to build an army to fight for the changes that our country desperately needs.
Maggie Oliver, thank you very much.